taking the time to join me on today's video. In today's video, we're continuing with session number 3 of our new series entitled Permanent Impairments of the Tendinopathies. And I have a fascinating program for you today. I'm sure you're going to enjoy this quite a bit. Now, in this program, we're talking about the many faces and the many clinical presentations of tendon disorders. And it's interesting because the AMA guides themselves do not provide for permanent impairment ratings specifically for tendinitis or tendinopathies. However, with a little bit of creative application of the charts, tables, and chapters in the AMA guides, you can provide for alternative impairment ratings for your examinee who is suffering from a tendon disorder condition that in all likelihood, because of the degenerative nature of tendons, in all likelihood that condition will never ever go on to recover to pre-injury status. And that's just the sad state of our current medical treatment for these types of conditions, which is only now evolving, and we're only now starting to understand the proper treatment methods for degenerative tendon conditions. And unfortunately, in the workers' compensation system, this treatment is largely unavailable to examinees at this time. So these conditions have a high propensity and a high likelihood to go on to become chronic and to fail to recover to pre-injury conditions. So it's important to be able to provide creative impairments that accurately describe the limitations that these conditions leave our examinees with. And we're going to get into how to provide for permanent impairment ratings for the most common tendinopathy conditions that you'll encounter, beginning with our very next session. We have a little bit of work to do before we get into that session. And before we get into today's session, let's just briefly review what we covered in session number 1 and session number 2. In session number 1, we talked about some statistics of tendinopathy conditions. And we concluded that in the industrial setting, tendinopathy conditions are largely underreported. Many workers are suffering from tendinitis and tendinopathy conditions, but they fail to report these conditions. And so these examinees and these statistics escape our modern statistic keeping methods. And so the statistics that we have regarding tendinopathy conditions are probably understated because of the large numbers of underreported examinees who may be suffering from these conditions. So once we talked about that, we then went into a discussion of the embryologic origin of tendons. And we stated that tendons, like all connective tissues of the body, derive from the embryonic mesoderm. And so because all connective tissues have the same embryologic origin, all connective tissues have features in common. And we went into those features in session number 2. So in session number 2, we talked about the common features of all connective tissues and tendons specifically, and that has to do with the fact that they all contain cells. All the connective tissues contain some composition of fibers, whether those fibers be collagen fibers, reticular fibers, or elastin fibers. And then all connective tissues, including tendon, have some quantity and consistency of what's referred to as extracellular matrix, sometimes also referred to as ground substance. And the reason that we talked about the molecular structure of tendons is to set the stage for today's discussion, where in today's discussion we're going to talk about the difference between normal healthy tendon and abnormal degenerative tendon. And as we're going to see, the difference between these two, healthy versus degenerative tendon, has to do with changes in each of these 3 components. Changes in the cells, changes in the fiber content and composition, and changes in the extracellular matrix content and composition. So normal healthy tendons we find have a homeostasis amongst all 3 of these structures, the cells, the fibers, and the matrix, whereas abnormal degenerative condition tendons show a loss of homeostasis with subsequent death of cells, subsequent degradation of the collagen fiber composition, and subsequent thickening and softening of the extracellular matrix. So once we establish the difference between normal and abnormal tendons, then we can get into the remainder of the program, where we're going to spend great time talking about permanent impairments of the shoulder, permanent impairments of the elbow, permanent impairments of the knee, and permanent impairments of the hip for those examinees who have degenerative tendinopathy conditions. So we have a lot of work to do today. So with no further ado, let's get started with today's discussion relating to abnormal versus degenerative tendons. Okay, so let's begin now. And what I want to do is I want to take you from the macroscopic anatomy of tendon all the way down to the microscopic anatomy of tendon, and actually all the way down to the electron microscopic level of tendon, so that we can see what takes place within the substance and structure of tendons when the tendon becomes painful and when the tendon undergoes degenerative change. So let's begin by taking a cross-section of muscle, and this could be any muscle here in the body. So imagine that this is, well, in this image it's being depicted as a cross-section of the brachioradialis muscle. So remember that the muscle blends into tendon, which blends into bone. So here shows that blending. And this area here where the muscle becomes tendinous, that's referred to as the myotendinous junction. And then the tendon, where the tendon becomes continuous with the bone, that's what's referred to as the enthesis. And you might have seen the term enthesopathies either in the literature or in diagnosis codes. And that refers to painful inflammation and degeneration at the junction of the tendon and the bone. Well, remember that the tendon then becomes continuous with the periosteum of the bone. So the periosteum of bone is nothing more than a continuation of the connective tissue outer layering of this tendon. So let's take a look at how this tendinous structure right in through here comes to be developed. And in order to understand that, let's trace this muscle all the way out into its smallest and final form, which is what we see right here. And this is one single muscle cell. Muscle cells are elongated cells, and so they're referred to as muscle fibers. So this is one individual muscle fiber that's been teased out of a group of muscle fibers, and then groups of muscle fibers, and then groups and groups and groups. And so we're all the way down here at the smallest final element, which is the single muscle cell. Well, muscle cells, like all cells of the body, are surrounded by a plasma membrane. And in muscle cells, we talk about the plasma membrane being referred to as the sarcolemma. Sarcolemma is the specific term that we give to the plasma membrane of muscle cells. Well, then the plasma membrane itself is surrounded by a thin layer of connective tissue composed largely of collagen, and that connective tissue we refer to as the endomysium. So this white structure right here that's being depicted here. This is the layer of endomysium, which is connective tissue that surrounds the plasma membrane of one individual muscle cell. So think of thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of muscle cells, each being surrounded by their own endomysium. Well, because muscle fibers are elongated cells, this endomysium continues along the length of the muscle cell. And then let's do it here in this diagram. Imagine this endomysium continuing along the length of the muscle cell through this cylindrical group of multiple muscle cells and continuing down, and it's this endomysium that contributes to the connective tissue down here at the tendinous structure. Okay, so that's one contributor to the structure of the tendon. So let's build on that. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to take a large collection of these muscle cells, these individual muscle fibers, and we're going to put them into a bundle, which is referred to as a fascicle. So this depicts here a fascicle, and as you can see, the fascicle is composed of hundreds and possibly thousands of individual muscle fiber cells. So the fascicle itself is surrounded by its own layer of connective tissue, and that connective tissue is referred to as the perimysium. So this arrow here is pointing to this layer of connective tissue surrounding this particular fascicle here. And like the endomysium, the perimysium continues backwards, 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 backwards along the length of the fascicle, and also contributes to the tendinous structure here. So what we're starting to see is that the tendinous structure or the connective tissue that contributes to the tendinous structure has its origin back in the individual muscle fiber and in the individual muscle belly itself. Well, on top of all of that, if we take all these groups of fascicles and bundle them together, we find that this larger bundle that we refer to as the muscle belly is surrounded by its own connective tissue layer known as the epimysium, and here is the epimysium here. The epimysium continues backward also and contributes to the structure of the tendon, which then becomes continuous with the periosteum of the bone. So this tendon structure right in through here is composed of contribution from the endomysium, from the perimysium, and the epimysium. So let's now take a look at the cross-sectional anatomy of what takes place here when we're considering solely the connective tissue and none of the muscle components. So now here we are back in the myotendinous junction where we have no muscle cells or muscle contributors or no muscle components. We're simply considering now the connective tissue tendinous structure. And we see that just as the individual muscle is made up of individual muscle cells, which are constructed into larger units and larger units and larger units to create the muscle belly, same type of hierarchy exists in the tendinous structure. So the smallest individual element of the tendon structure is the collagen fibril. And the collagen fibrils are constructed in triple helices. Triple helices are composed of triple helices to construct the next larger unit, the collagen fibers. So the collagen fibers have to be constructed from the smaller elements, the collagen fibrils. Well, these collagen fibers these collagen fibrils are secreted by the tendon cells. The tendon cells reside in here in the primary fiber bundle, and these cells secrete the collagen fibrils. And once those collagen fibrils are secreted from the intracellular environment of the tendon cells to the extracellular environment of the tendon cells, then they become arranged into triple helices collagen fibers. We refer to those as collagen fibers. So this is a collagen fiber that's constructed by one single tendon cell. Well, these collagen fibers are bound up into fascicles, and the fascicles themselves are surrounded by another layer of connective tissue known as the endotenon. So all of these fibers are surrounded here by another layer of connective tissue and another layer of connective tissue here. all of which contributes to the myotendinous junction. Well, the secondary fiber bundles here are assembled and bundled into larger bundles known as the tertiary fiber bundles. And those tertiary fiber bundles themselves are also surrounded by connective tissue layers known as the endotenon. The secondary fiber bundles are themselves all surrounded by a larger connective tissue layer known as the epitenon. And then in certain areas of the body where the tendons pass through synovial sheaths, there is an additional layer of connective tissue covering known as the paratenon. So the take-home message about the structure of tendons is that the structure of tendons begins in the belly of the muscle with the connective tissue layers of the individual muscle fibers, and then the fascicles, and then the entire covering of the muscle itself. And those connective tissue coverings continue back into the myotendinous junction, where the myotendinous junction, it consists entirely of bundles and bundles and bundles of collagen fibers, all of which themselves are surrounded by bundles and bundles and bundles of collagen fibers to construct a tendinous structure that's very strong, that's very resistant to tensile stress, and that can stand great loads when it's healthy. However, when it's unhealthy, we're going to see changes in not only the microscopic but also the macroscopic structure of each of these subunits. So in order to understand how tendons undergo degenerative changes, it's important to understand some of the molecular and cellular structures that comprise the tendon. So again, we said that tendons are composed of cells, they're composed of collagen fibers, and they're composed of extracellular matrix. And with degenerative changes in the tendon, we're going to see changes in each of these three substructures. Now, an important principle to understand is that tendons, when they're maintained either in a healthy condition or whether they're undergoing a degenerative condition, the maintenance of tendon is accomplished through a combination of mechanical and chemical signals. And similarly, the degenerative changes that occur in tendon are a result of mechanical and chemical signals. So let's talk first about how chemical signals, both healthy chemical signals and degenerative chemical signals, are propagated through tendon cells. And in order to understand that, it's important to know that tendon cells are in adjacent contact with each other, and there's communication from cell to cell to cell through specialized connections between the cells known as connexons. So here shows a series of cells, and these are not tendon cells. These look like epithelial cells, perhaps from the large intestine. I say that because they're demonstrating here the microvilli that are commonly found in the epithelial lining of the duodenum, for example. But this is going to be illustrative of the same phenomenon in tendon cells. And there are connections, specialized connections between those cells known as gap junctions. So here's an illustration here of gap junctions. Here's another illustration here of gap junctions. And then here's a blow up of gap junctions. So let's take a look closer at these gap junctions. So here we have a blow-up diagram depicting these gap junctions. And what these gap junctions consist of is they consist of embedded proteins within the cell membrane of the tendon cell. So this is the plasma membrane of the tenocyte. And there's these embedded transmembrane proteins known as connexons. Well, through these connexons, there is a straight channel through which chemicals can pass, such that when a chemical signal is initiated in this cell, that chemical signal can pass to an adjacent cell. And then from the adjacent cell, it can then pass to an adjacent cell. And chemicals generated in this cell quickly find themselves distributed to all tendon cells because all tendon cells are in contact with each other through these gap junctions. So therefore, a stimulus produced in one single tendon cell gets propagated to tendon cells even distant within the same tendon. And therefore, health is maintained. Health and homeostasis can be maintained throughout the tendon. But unfortunately, when degenerative signals, we'll put those with a frowning signals, are generated in this particular tendon cell, those degenerative chemical signals also pass not only to the adjacent cell next door, but also to all tendon cells within the tendon through these specialized connections known as gap junctions. So this is how degenerative signals and also how healthy signals are propagated throughout the entire substance of the tendon cell. So let's take a look at an example as to how degenerative signals can cause changes in the three structures that comprise the tendon itself. That is the cells, the extracellular matrix, and also the collagen fibers. So here we have a section of tendinous tissue, and this particular image here on the left, this depicts tendinous tissue at rest. In the middle depicts tendinous tissue under tensile or stretching load. And then the third image on the right depicts tendon under compressive load. So let's take a look at the microscopic structure. So in green, they're depicting here, this is a tendon cell, a tenocyte cell. And the red here is the plasma membrane of the tendon cell. The green is depicting the cytoplasm intracellularly within the interior of the tendon cell. And then this white structure here is the cell nucleus. And then outside the tendon cell, we have the collagen fibers. And because this tendon is at rest and not under any particular load, it shows a slight disorientation of these collagen fibers. And then the third component of tendon is that there's some extracellular matrix. So the extracellular matrix in tendons is quite scant, and so there's very little extracellular matrix depicted in this image. But imagine that there's some fluid environment in between these cells here, with some quantity and consistency of proteoglycans and glycosaminoglycans comprising the fluid environment out here in the extracellular region. Okay, so that's the microscopic structure. Then in this image here, we have a tendon depicted to be under tension. This might be, for example, the Achilles tendon as a person ascends stairs. And the fibers, the collagen fibers, align and become oriented linearly and parallel. And the cell itself is subject to stretching or tensile loading, meaning that these collagen fibers, through connections, through protein transmembrane connections, and those proteins are known as integrins, integrin proteins. These integrin proteins cause a stretching on the plasma membrane here of the tenocyte cell, and you can see it's being depicted here as a thinner membrane than it is being depicted here when the cell is at rest. So those tensile loads, those mechanical loads, are going to cause changes intracellular through mechanical and chemical signaling that, number one, will help to maintain the extracellular matrix and the collagen fibers in healthy tendon, but unfortunately will cause degradation and deterioration of the extracellular matrix when that tensile load is inappropriate, or when that tensile load overloads the tendon. Okay? And we'll trace some of those changes in just a couple minutes. And then here in this image depicts a tendon under compressive load. And you might think of this as, for example, the patellar tendon. As the knee goes through increasing angles of knee flexion, the patellar tendon is tractioned and compressed over the tibial plateau, and that would create a compressive load on the tendon cell, and that's being depicted here as a smaller and narrower distance between the opposite ends of the plasma membrane. So this is a tensile load in the middle and a compressive load in the middle, on the right. And you can see that a compressive load creates a different impact on the nucleus of the tenocyte cell than does a tensile load. Well, similarly, this compressive load is going to create a series of mechanical signals and a series of chemical signals that are going to alter protein expression. It's going to alter gene expression, and it's going to alter the protein quality of the product produced as a result of gene expression. And that's either going to help to maintain the integrity of the collagen fibers, or it's going to result in a degradation of the collagen fibers through the production of a low quality, poor quality protein output product. Okay? So how does this mechanical and chemical signaling take place? Well, let's take a closer look. In order to understand how this mechanical and chemical signaling takes place, we're going to have to back out of the gross macroscopic structure of the tendon and take a moment and take a look inside the tenocyte cell in order to understand how this process takes place. So here we have an example of a typical animal cell. This isn't exactly a tendon cell, but it's going to be a representative cell that helps us understand some of the internal structures that contribute to the homeostasis or lack of homeostasis of the tendon cell. So for our purposes, with regards to tendons, we're going to see that tendon cells have a nucleus. Tendon cells have rough endoplasmic reticulum. Tendon cells have Golgi apparatus. And tendon cells are going to have export protein products that are going to be secreted from the interior of vesicles on the Golgi apparatus. They're going to be secreted into the extracellular environment to construct the collagen fibers. So if you remember back to Biology 101, genes in the nucleus result in the production of messenger RNA. Messenger RNA, the production of messenger RNA, we refer to that as transcription. And then messenger RNA is translated into a protein product in the rough endoplasmic reticulum on the ribosomes, these little studded structures here on the endoplasmic reticulum. And then those protein products, those collagen fibril subunits, are going to be deposited in the Golgi apparatus and then exported by exocytosis. So we're going to see some of that taking place in tendon cells. And then also important in tendon cells is to know that within the entire structure of this cell, cells have their own skeleton. It's referred to as the cytoskeleton. And the cytoskeleton gives the cell structure, it gives it rigidity, and it gives it strength. And it gives it, in tendons, the capacity to resist damage due to these tensile and compressive forces. Tendon cells are constantly under tensile and compressive forces, and were it not for the cytoskeleton, those tendon cells would be very quickly damaged. Now, tendon cells do become damaged with overloading, overcompressing, and over-tensile stresses, and we're going to see exactly how that occurs. So the cytoskeleton is composed of at least 3 structures. We have intermediate filaments, as depicted here by these yellow protein fibers. and those project all throughout the interior of the cell. We have also microtubules, depicted here by these additional yellow structures, it appears. There's also microfilaments that compose the cytoskeleton. And so if we take a close-up look at the cytoskeleton, we can see that the cytoskeleton extends the entire interior structure of the tendon cell. So here's a three-dimensional representation of the cytoskeleton. And you can see that the cytoskeleton, at least in this example, consists of three main structures. Number one, the microfilaments here in green, and you can see that those are waving throughout the entirety of the interior, three-dimensionally that is, the interior of the cell. Then there's the intermediate filaments depicted here in, looks like red, transcending and crisscrossing all throughout the interior of the cell. And then also microtubules depicted here in blue. And notice all of these microtubules traverse the interior of the cell, all surrounding these organelles within the cell, specifically and especially surrounding the nucleus of the cell. And if we use staining techniques to stain specifically each of these cytoskeletal structures, we see that using staining techniques specifically to stain the microfilaments, we get an electron micrograph similar to the following, with this multiple green overlapping and crisscrossing protein microfilament structure all surrounding the nucleus within the interior of the cell. Similarly, if we use a different staining technique that's specific for the intermediate filaments, we get another depiction of the microfilament cytoskeleton within the interior of the cell, all surrounding the nucleus, which is somewhere here in this central region. And if we put them all together, all these different staining techniques that are specific for each of these specific type of subunits that make up the cytoskeleton, we get this crisscrossing and multi-layered and very complex skeletal structure within the interior of the cell, all of which surrounds and connects to the nucleus within the center of the cell. So this is going to be important to understand because it's this cytoskeleton that's going to be able to provide the means of communication of mechanical signals from the exterior of the cell to the interior of the cell, that's then going to cause the nucleus to ramp up and produce either normal protein collagen product or to produce abnormal degenerative protein collagen content. Okay, so let's take a look at exactly how these mechanical and chemical signals cause the nucleus to rev up into action. Okay, so let's take a look at this phenomenon as to how normal healthy tendon is supported and maintained through a combination of mechanical and chemical signals, and also how degenerative tendons decay also as a result of mechanical and chemical signaling. So here we have depictions of tenocytes. The green is the cytoplasm, the red is the plasma membrane, the white is the nucleus. And remember that cells are connected through gap junctions such that there's communication from cell to cell to cell. So therefore, a chemical signal that's produced in this cell right here very quickly spreads through gap junctions to this cell, very quickly spreads through gap junctions to this cell, and all cells within the substance of the tendon receive and are bathed in those same chemical signals. But also tendon cells respond to mechanical signals. So let's take a look at how these chemical and mechanical signals are generated. So here, if we take a cross section across the membrane of this tenocyte cell, we get a piece of the nucleus here, we get a piece of the plasma membrane here, and we blow it up, and it looks like this right here. Well, out here is extracellular matrix. This is the collagen fibers, depicted in this diagram over here as brown. So here is the brown collagen fiber running parallel to the surface of the plasma membrane of the tenocyte cell here. And recall that the tenocyte cell has these embedded proteins known as integrin proteins. These integrin proteins are transmembrane proteins that span both the interior and the exterior of the plasma membrane of the tenocyte cell. Well, this is fascinating. This is fascinating. These integrin proteins have connections to the cytoskeleton within the interior of the tenocyte cell. So remember, the cytoskeleton is all distributed throughout the interior of the tenocyte cell. And here in this diagram, the cytoskeleton is depicted by this sort of scaffolding structure of embedded proteins into the membrane of the nucleus here. So these integrin proteins span the membrane of the tenocyte cell and have connections to the cytoskeleton, such that mechanical deformation of these integrin proteins through either tensile or compressive loadings causes tugging or pulling or mechanical forces to be imparted to the cytoskeleton, which causes signaling to the nucleus to begin the expression of genes that result in the production of messenger RNA that results in the production of either normal or abnormal protein export products to either maintain or cause degradation of the collagen fibers. Okay, so let's take even a closer look at this phenomenon. Okay, so let's take a look at this phenomenon, and this phenomenon is referred to as mechanotransduction. And it's a very complex process, but we're going to simplify it for our purposes by simply stating that mechanical loading stimulates protein synthesis at the cellular level. Now, the protein that is synthesized, meaning the collagen fibers that is synthesized by the tendon cell, can be either normal, healthy collagen fibers, or can be unhealthy, degenerative, weak type 3 collagen fibers that result in tendon weakening. And it all is based upon the nature and the quantity of mechanical loading. So we reviewed this section in our last slide. So here, let's take a look at a tendon that is subject to mechanical stress in the form of a tensile load. So these arrows depict that there's tensile load being directed along the tendon in this direction. So this could be, for example, the Achilles tendon in an examinee who's walking upstairs. So this tensile loading and the stretching of these collagen fibers causes a deformation in these integrin proteins. And they're depicting a deformation by showing that there's a force being directed along this direction, in the direction of this yellow arrow, and that causes a tilting or a deformation of these integrins. See here, they're depicting the integrin proteins being oriented perpendicular. Here they're being oriented slightly diagonal, and that's indicating that these are being mechanically deformed and causing some tugging, pulling, or stretching on the cytoskeletal structures here. Well, it's this tugging and stretching and deformation of the cytoskeletal structures, along with the deformation of these integrin proteins, that causes two things to happen. It causes the development and the production of chemical signals, which are being depicted here. Chemical signals with a series of chemical intermediaries that result in a signal being directed to the nucleus to cause protein synthesis. And then also this mechanical signal through the deformation and tugging on the cytoskeleton that causes, again, a mechanically initiated gene transcription and protein synthesis, both of which result in the formation of newly formed proteins, as depicted here by these little images. These newly formed proteins are then packaged up in the Golgi apparatus and are transported extracellularly for synthesis and integration into the extracellular matrix here. Now, these protein fibrils, this export newly formed protein, can either be good quality or inferior quality protein products. So in the presence of normal protein product export, we have the maintenance and the homeostasis of normal tendon. But in the case of excessive loading, overloading, repetitive trauma, cumulative trauma, and tendon injury, then we see the export of deficient or immature formed proteins that result in a degradation or a deterioration in the strength and structure of this extracellular matrix. So let's take a look at some of the differences between normal healthy tendon as a result of normal protein export product compared to unhealthy tendon as a result of immature and poor quality protein export product. So in the context of normal homeostasis of the tendon, in the presence of normal loading of the tendon, if we take a look at the normal tendon under the microscope, we see that the tendon is brilliant white. It has a fibroelastic structure with a firm texture, and you've probably seen tendon in some of the steak and beef that you've eaten. It's that white substance that runs down the middle between different bundles and groups of muscle, which is the meat portion that you chew. Under the microscope, we see that the collagen fibers are organized and they're parallel, just as depicted in some of the previous images. We see that the tenocyte nuclei are spindle-shaped, and they're all arranged in a parallel alignment such that the tenocytes nuclei are oriented parallel with each other along lines of parallelity. We're going to see that there's some change in this parallel alignment in degenerative tendon. Also, we see that the collagen fibers are densely and tightly packed together. Because they're all composed of the same type of type 3 collagen, all of the fibers have a uniform diameter and a uniform orientation. So we see there's normal appearance of the cells, there's normal appearance of the extracellular matrix consisting of the collagen fibers. Now, what type of changes do you think we can see in the presence of degenerative tendons? With degenerative tendons under the microscope, no longer is the tendon brilliant white. It changes color to a gray or brown type of a tint. We see that the tissue is thin, the tissue is fragile and disorganized, and there's sort of a loose texture due to proliferation of the aqueous extracellular environment. We see that what was once organized and parallel collagen fibers becomes now disorganized. We see an increase in the extracellular matrix ground substance with large mucoid patches and open vacuoles between the fibers. We see an increased number of tenocyte nuclei with a loss of parallel alignment, which would look like this. Non-parallel alignment of tenocyte nuclei with an increase in the number of nuclei. And then we also see an increase in vascular and nerve infiltration into this loose and disorganized tissue. So there's an increased vascularity through vasculogenesis, and there's an increase in nerve endings through neurogenesis.
We see that there is angulation and bubble formation of collagen fibers, which is due to the infiltration of vacuoles. We see there's variations in the diameter and orientation of the collagen fibers due to various types of collagen fibers now making presence within the extracellular matrix, including type 1 collagen, type 3 collagen, and type 5 collagen. And we see hypoxic changes in the tenocytes as the tenocytes start to degenerate from aerobic metabolism to a more anaerobic type of metabolism. So we see changes in the cells and we see changes in the extracellular matrix. Okay? So let's talk about what's known about tendon degenerative changes. And the current model that describes tendon degenerative changes describes those changes as occurring along a continuum. So this is the continuum of tendon pathology. Now, there are other models of tendon pathology described in the literature, but the most commonly accepted model that describes tendon degenerative changes is known as the continuum model. So let's talk about the continuum model of tendon pathology, and we're going to see that the continuum model has three distinct stages. So in the reactive stage of tendon pathology, the cause of the reactive stage of tendon pathology is one of two things. It's either due to excessive loading or it's due to underloading. Now, excessive loading would describe someone who's subject to repetitive or cumulative trauma and heavy lifting, for example, whereas underloading, also known as stress shielding, this is going to be found in a person who is basically sedentary and is not regularly subjecting their tendons to normal loading. So this is a person who's deconditioned, and this is a person who is a prime candidate for tendinopathy conditions because their tendons are unhealthy. They're unhealthy because they're constantly underloaded and they become degenerative. So tendons are interesting. They either have to be properly loaded to maintain homeostasis, or when they are either overloaded or underloaded, the tendon gets out of homeostasis and enters the reactive stage of tendon pathology. So these are your two populations here that are at risk for tendon pathology. Those that are repetitively overloading their tendons, or those that consistently underload their tendons that then go out to engage in activity that puts an acute overload on those reactive and degenerative tendons. Well, structurally, we see that this condition is generally non-inflammatory. That's why it's not referred to as tendinitis, but it's more commonly referred to and more properly referred to as tendinopathy. We see that there's tendon thickening, and this is an early change in the stages of tendon pathology. Tendon thickening as a result of changes in the extracellular matrix. So initial changes in the continuum model of tendon pathology take place not in the cells, but take place in the collagen and in the extracellular matrix through thickening of the tendons. Now, this thickening of the tendons can be a problem in regions of the body where there is no extra space to give. So, for example, thickening of the tendons of the finger flexor tendons as they pass through the carpal tunnel is a problem because there is no excess space to be able to absorb thickening of the tendons through the carpal tunnel. Similarly, in the subacromial space in the shoulder, which is generally a very narrow, tight space, constrained above and below by bony structures, any thickening of the supraspinatus tendon contributes to worsening problems through impingement up in the shoulder. So this tendon thickening can create primary problems within the tendon itself, but also can contribute to secondary problems simply as a result of the space-occupying nature of thickened tendons. Well, in the reactive stage, we see no changes in the neural or vascular anatomy. In other words, there's no vasculogenesis or angiogenesis, and there's no neurogenesis. And this condition is generally reversible with appropriate load management. Now, if you're a primary treating physician or if you're a qualified medical evaluator, referring or even rendering treatment for these examinees, it's important that you supply them with treatment that involves appropriate loads. What's the opposite of appropriate loads? The opposite of appropriate loads is inappropriate loads. And inappropriate loads will either overload or underload the tendon and will contribute to the continuum of tendon pathology. But proper load management and the administration of proper loads can cause a reversal of this reactive stage, and that's the whole trick with performing therapy on these types of examinees, is finding the appropriate load versus administering inappropriate loads. Now, if the reactive stage is not able to be controlled through appropriate loading and the examinee continues to overload the tendinous structure, then we continue along into the disrepair stage. And the disrepair stage is just the next progression of the reactive stage. And what happens in the disrepair stage is there's a failed healing attempt, and the examinee continues to perform the same repetitive activities while not allowing a sufficient opportunity for healing of the tendon. And what happens is the matrix now continues to break down and become disorganized. So in the reactive stage, we saw the first structural changes taking place in the extracellular matrix. In the disrepair stage, the extracellular matrix continues to break down and become increasingly disorganized, but we don't yet see changes in the cellular structures. Those are going to come later. So again, the point is that early degenerative changes of tendon take place in the collagen and extracellular matrix. At this stage, we may see an increase in vascularity and neuronal ingrowth, and this contributes to thickening and painful nature of the tendon at this stage. Again, this condition is reversible with load management and also with attenuation of risk factors. And we're going to talk more about risk factors as we go, but recall that tendinopathy conditions are the result of both intrinsic and extrinsic factors. And so intrinsic risk factors are factors within the individual themselves, such as their age, such as their physical condition, such as whether or not they're a smoker, such as whether or not they are obese. So those are intrinsic risk factors. Extrinsic risk factors have to do with the nature of the repetitive activity. So with examinees suffering from tendon pathology, we want to, as much as possible, attenuate both the intrinsic and extrinsic risk factors. If we're able to do that, then we're going to be able to stimulate matrix resynthesis and matrix repair at this stage. But if we're not able to attenuate the risk factors, then we're going to progress into the final stage of tendon pathology. The final stage of tendon pathology is the degenerative stage. And in the degenerative stage, we're now going to see changes in the tendon cells. We're going to see the tenocytes undergoing apoptosis, which is cell death. We're going to see further disorganization and degradation of the matrix, where type 1 collagen becomes replaced with immature and weak type 3 collagen. We're going to see degradation of the matrix, where the matrix becomes more puffy, more aqueous, and more fluid, thereby contributing to further thickening of the tendon. And now we're going to see neuronal ingrowth and neovascularization in this degenerative stage, which contributes both to the pain and to the thickening of the tendon. At this stage, this condition is likely irreversible because of the loss of mature tendon cells, which are responsible for the production of the extracellular matrix. Because of the death of so many cells, we see that the extracellular matrix is simply unable to be repaired. And in this stage, it's a real danger because the tendon thins and becomes weak to such a point that it progresses to rupture of the tendon. And when you have rupture of the tendon, you have real problems, not only because the rupture requires surgical repair, but also because the repair tissue itself is of a poor quality tissue, again, subject to and multiple re-rupture. So here is a cross-section of normal tendon here on the left, degenerative tendon on the right. And you can see under the microscope that a normal healthy tendon has a parallel and organized arrangement of the collagen fibers. The tenocyte nuclei are spindle-shaped or ovoid and are aligned parallel and in regular fashion. Whereas in degenerative tendinopathy, the tenocyte nuclei become more circular, more rounded, more disorganized, not in any particular orientation or organization. And the collagen fibers are disorganized, are wavy, and are non-parallel. And this is a degenerative tendon that is consistently and chronically painful, consistently and chronically weak. And the real danger comes with overload of this type of a degenerative tendon, which can then result in rupture of the tendon. So this is on the on the microscopic level. Let's take a look at what degenerative and normal tendon would look like on the macroscopic level. So here we have a cross section of a tendon to help depict normal versus abnormal tendon. And here's the normal tendon here on the left. And it shows the cell nuclei arranged in parallel fashion, ovoid shape cell nuclei with regularly arranged collagen fibrils oriented parallel and tightly packed, and depicting here normal tightly bundled type 1 collagen fibrils. Whereas degenerative tendon has increased cellularity and the cells are different. The reason that the cells are different and the reason that the cells no longer have these ovoid and organized cell nuclei, but rather have these sort of circular and disorganized cell nuclei is because they're different types of cells. These cells revert back to the embryonic progenitor stem cell, the undifferentiated stem cell, and we see that these cells, because they're not mature and differentiated tenocyte cells, they produce a variety of connective tissue structural elements. In fact, in degenerative tendon itself, some studies indicate that some of the extracellular matrix becomes filled with cartilage type of substance, similar to what would be produced by chondrocyte cells. Well, in this diagram, they're indicating that these normal tenocyte cells are being replaced by myofibroblasts, which produce a combination of muscle tissue and also a combination of fibrotic type of weakened tissue. So we really see a sort of amalgamation of different connective tissue products within this abnormal tendon. The connective tissue becomes infiltrated with new blood vessels and new nerve endings, and we see an increase and a thickening of the extracellular matrix with collagen fibers in disarray and disorganized, and infiltrated by blood vessels and painful nerve endings. And this is the type of structure that's going to be subject to rupture. Okay, so let's take a look and summarize this whole process. Okay, so let's make this real by looking at an actual tendon. And so here we have an example of the Achilles tendon. And let's imagine that this is the Achilles tendon in two populations of people. One is an Achilles tendon in a worker who works on his feet all day, but who has a recent change of job duties that requires that he carry heavy building materials up and down hills for a period of 5 days as he finds himself on a new job site with a new change in his job duties. So that's the first population. And then the second population would be a sedentary employee who sits all day at a computer and whose tendon is not accustomed to repetitive and heavy loading. And all of a sudden, this particular examinee finds himself on the weekend going on a stressful hike up and down hills. And let's see what takes place in the tendons of these respective two populations of examinees. So as these examinees go through their activities up and down hills, carrying construction materials, or simply going on a hike, the Achilles tendon is going to be subjective to repetitive loading. It's going to be subjective to tensile forces in this direction. And then as the tendon comes and bends around this bony prominence on the calcaneus, it's going to be subjective to compressive forces here. Now, in the presence of normal forces that this tendon can handle within the context of its homeostatic function, there will be no change and no alteration and no damage or injury to this tendon. But in the case of both of these examinees, they're both experiencing a change in their normal activity level of their Achilles tendon because of the change in the job duties of the construction worker and a change in the physical activities of the sedentary employee. So both of these examinees are going to be subject to injury and degenerative changes in the tendon through the continuum model of tendon pathology. So with both of these examinees, we start out with normal tendon. Normal tendon. Now, in the sedentary examinee, through stress shielding and consistent underloading of the tendon, that examinee is going to have a mechanically weaker tendon. When this examinee then goes out on the weekend and takes a hike, he's going to subject the Achilles tendon to excessive or unaccustomed load. Now, in addition to the sudden or acute excessive load, if this examinee has intrinsic risk factors for tendinopathy, such as obesity, such as being a smoker, such as being of black race, such as being greater than 40 years old, that's going to begin the degenerative continuum, and the examinee is going to enter the reactive stage of tendinopathy. Similarly, the construction worker who starts the work week with normal tendons finds himself in the presence of excessive loading due to the change in his job duties requiring him to carry construction materials up and down hills. He also is going to find himself in an overload situation that begins the reactive tendinopathy stage of the tendinopathy continuum. If there is no appropriate intervention at this point, the tendon will continue to degenerate and go through the tendon disrepair phase and eventually into the degenerative tendinopathy phase. Now, for those that are qualified medical evaluators recommending medical treatment, or for those that are primary treating physicians, our goal is to reverse this degenerative pathway and help these examinees by prescribing load modifications and load management strategies that remove excessive loading from the tendon and apply appropriate and modified loads to the tendon. If we can apply appropriate modified loads to the tendon, and if we can attenuate some of the risk factors associated with tendinopathy, we refer to that as optimizing the load. In other words, administering loads that are neither excessive nor insufficient. If we can optimize the load, we can get some reversal of the tendon pathology continuum. The tendon can adapt through the formation of normal extracellular matrix, which can then cause a re-strengthening and a reversal of the tendon disrepair process. And this is the whole trick to the medical treatment puzzle, is to apply optimized load to the tendon and to attenuate the risk factors that contribute to tendon pathology.
So doctors, I hope this helps you. This is probably more than you ever knew about tendinopathies, or perhaps ever wanted to know. But it's important to understand the structure of tendons on the microscopic level so that you can understand the processes that take place when tendons become painful and degenerative. And this process is taking place all the time in examinees in the shoulders, in the elbows, in the wrists, in the hips, in the knees, and in the feet and ankles. And if this process is taking place, and if the reversal of tendinopathy is so difficult because of the inherent difficulties in optimizing loads, many of these examinees are going to go on to have permanent and irreversible changes that result in permanent impairment. So in our very next session, we're going to talk about the permanent impairments that tendinopathy conditions can leave examinees in the shoulder and in the upper extremity. And we're going to talk about how the AMA guides, even though they don't directly discuss permanent impairments related to tendinopathies, the impairments associated with tendinopathies are in the AMA guides. There are charts, there are chapters, there are tables within the AMA guides that we can use to ascribe and describe the impairments related to these tendinopathy conditions. So I look forward to being with you on our very next session as we begin the second part of this program related to the permanent impairments of both the upper and lower extremities. So for now, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I want to thank you for taking the time to join me on today's video. I look forward to being with you on future videos as well. And for now, I'm wishing you best of success in your career as a qualified medical evaluator.